Baghdad had been silent for 3 days. The great city that once echoed with the calls of merchants, the laughter of children, now held only the sound of wind whistling through broken gates. Dogs roamed freely through the palace corridors, licking human brains off marble steps that had once been kissed by kings. But it wasn't the smell that would make your blood run cold. It was the towers. 120 towers of human skulls, each one perfectly constructed, each one a geometric monument to systematic evil. 90,000 people had been transformed into building materials by a man whose cruelty was so calculated, so perfectly orchestrated, that witnesses called him the architect of hell itself. This is the real story of how Tamerlane didn't just conquer Baghdad, he erased it from existence. And here's the part that'll make your blood run cold. This wasn't random medieval violence. This was industrial-scale murder with quotas, deadlines, and quality control. In 1336, near the village of Kesh in modern-day Uzbekistan, a baby is born into poverty who will grow up to make Hitler look like a Sunday school teacher. His name is Timur, but history will remember him as Tamerlane, the Iron Lord, the scourge of God, the man who turned genocide into an art form. But here's what makes Tamerlane's story so terrifying. He didn't start as a king or a prince, he was a shepherd, a poor kid from the Barlas tribe, who spent his days grazing sheep and goats for wealthy landowners, earning just enough to keep his family from starving. When Timur was 8 years old, his father died, leaving him and his mother in crushing poverty. Most days, they could barely afford one meal. Young Timur would spend entire days in the scorching sun, watching other people's livestock, dreaming of something greater, while his stomach gnawed at itself from hunger. In the evenings, he worked as a blacksmith's assistant, his small hands already learning to shape iron, a skill that would later become symbolic of his iron will to conquer the world. The other children mocked him for his poverty, for his patched clothes, for the way he smelled of sheep and smoke. But even as a child, there was something different about Timur, something cold and calculating behind those eyes. When local bandits stole sheep from his employers, young Timur didn't just report it, he tracked them down and took the animals back by force. When older boys bullied him, he didn't cry or run home. He waited, he planned, and then he struck back with a violence that shocked everyone who witnessed it. By his teens, Timur had gathered a small gang of equally desperate young men. They started as sheep thieves, but quickly graduated to highway robbery. It was during one of these raids that an arrow shattered his right leg and mangled his hand, leaving him permanently lame and missing 2 fingers. The nickname Timuri Lang, Timur the Lame, would follow him for the rest of his life. But here's what's really disturbing about Tamerlane. He wasn't some savage barbarian. Even as a bandit, he was brilliant, cultured, and absolutely fascinated by power. He could speak multiple languages fluently. He could debate philosophy with scholars. He patronized artists and poets. The man who would build pyramids from human skulls understood geometry, engineering, aesthetics. When he looked at a city, he didn't just see a military target. He saw raw materials for his next masterpiece. And that's what makes this story so much more terrifying than your typical medieval massacre. Tamerlane didn't kill people in fits of rage. He killed them with the same methodical precision that other architects used to build cathedrals. Through cunning, brutality, and sheer force of will, the shepherd boy clawed his way to power. By 1370, he controlled the Chagatai Khanate. By 1400, his empire stretched from Turkey to India. He had already perfected his technique at Isfahan, where he built his first skull pyramid from 70,000 heads after the city rebelled against his taxes. In Delhi, he had executed 100,000 Hindu prisoners in a single day before battle, fearing they might revolt during combat. In Damascus, he had burned and tortured thousands while deporting the city's finest artisans to his capital. But Baghdad was going to be different. Baghdad was going to be personal. To understand why Baghdad suffered such a horrific fate, you need to know about Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, the man whose arrogance signed the death warrant for 90,000 innocent people. Ahmad ruled Baghdad and much of Iraq from his palace on the Tigris. He was everything Tamerlane despised: born into wealth, handed power on a silver platter, soft from a life of luxury, while Tamerlane had fought for every scrap of authority. Clawing his way up from shepherd to emperor, Ahmad had inherited his throne. For years, the two rulers had exchanged increasingly hostile letters. Tamerlane, flush with victories across Asia, demanded Ahmad's submission. The message was simple: acknowledge me as your superior, pay tribute, and your city will be spared. Ahmad's response was a masterpiece of aristocratic contempt. Not only did he refuse to submit, but he sent back letters dripping with insults about Tamerlane's humble origins, his physical disabilities, and his barbaric background. He mocked the shepherd who dared to threaten a sultan. He laughed at the lame bandit who thought himself the equal of legitimate royalty. But the final insult, the one that sealed Baghdad's fate, came when Ahmad publicly declared that he would rather see his city burn than bow to a crippled sheep herder who thinks himself a king. When that message reached Tamerlane's court in Samarkand, witnesses said the conqueror's face went white with rage. For a man who had spent his entire life proving that birth meant nothing compared to will and strength, Ahmad's words cut deeper than any sword. Tamerlane had shown mercy to cities that surrendered. He had spared populations that submitted without resistance. But Baghdad had chosen to insult not just Tamerlane the conqueror, but Timur the shepherd boy who still lived inside him. Baghdad was going to pay for every slight, every mockery, every aristocratic sneer that Tamerlane had endured in his rise from poverty to power. This wasn't going to be just another conquest. This was going to be personal. When Tamerlane's army surrounded Baghdad in the summer of 1401, he didn't just order his soldiers to kill everyone, he gave them quotas. Each soldier had to produce exactly 2 heads, not 1, not 3, 2. Failure to meet the quota meant forfeiting their own head. The mathematics was simple and absolutely terrifying. With an army of tens of thousands that guaranteed exactly 90,000 deaths. Think about that for a second. This wasn't the heat of battle. This wasn't soldiers getting carried away in the moment. This was premeditated mass murder with spreadsheets and quality control. It only gets worse. When Tamerlane's soldiers started running out of victims, something happened that reveals just how terrified they were of their leader. They began killing their own prisoners, then their own camp followers, then each other's wives and children. The quota had to be met, and if that meant murdering your own family to avoid Tamerlane's wrath, well, that's what you did. The siege of Baghdad lasted exactly 6 weeks and 1 day. But this wasn't a typical medieval siege with catapults and battering rams. This was psychological warfare designed to break the city's spirit before the walls ever fell. Tamerlane's engineers didn't just attack the walls, they poisoned the water supply, they diverted the Tigris River, they filled the wells with corpses and human waste. The message was crystal clear: surrender now, or watch your children die of thirst and disease. But Baghdad's defenders chose to fight. Led by the remaining forces loyal to Sultan Ahmad, they held those ancient walls with everything they had. For 6 weeks, one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world refused to die. Then Tamerlane noticed something that would seal Baghdad's fate. The defenders, exhausted by weeks of fighting in the brutal summer heat, had started propping their helmets on sticks to create the illusion of continued resistance while they sought shelter from the sun. That's when he knew they were finished. The final assault began at dawn on a July morning in 1401. When the walls finally fell, what followed wasn't conquest, it was systematic extermination. Here's the part that historians don't want you to know about medieval warfare. It wasn't chaotic. When professionals like Tamerlane's army went to work, it was as organized as a factory assembly line. The city was divided into sectors. Each unit was assigned a specific area. Officers carried lists and checked off completed quotas. It was an industrial operation with middle management and quality control. No quarter was given, not to women, not to the elderly, not to children. When the soldiers began running short of victims in their assigned sectors, they didn't just stop, they couldn't stop. The quota had to be met. Contemporary accounts describe hearing a soldier weeping as he beheaded his own wife, rather than face Tamerlane's punishment for failing to meet his quota. The man was sobbing, forgive me," as he brought down the sword. That's the level of terror Tamerlane inspired. His own soldiers would rather murder their loved ones than disappoint him. When the killing finally stopped, the real horror began. Because Tamerlane wasn't just a conqueror, he was an artist, and his medium was human suffering. From the 90,000 severed heads, his architects began constructing their masterpiece. 120 towers of skulls, each one a perfect geometric structure designed to last for centuries. These weren't crude piles of bones thrown together by exhausted soldiers. These were engineered monuments, carefully planned and precisely executed. The skulls were sorted by size. They were arranged in mathematical patterns. They were cemented together with mortar mixed from lime, sand, and human blood. Each tower stood exactly 20 feet high, tall enough to be visible for miles across the desert. When you approached Baghdad from any angle, you would see Tamerlane's message spelled out in human remains. This is what happens to those who insult the shepherd boy. When Tamerlane's army finally departed Baghdad in August 1401, they left behind something that was no longer a city. It was a graveyard with walls. The House of Peace had become the House of Death. Modern historians estimate that Tamerlane's campaigns resulted in the deaths of 17 million people, 5% of the world's population at the time. But numbers can't capture the true horror of what occurred. What Tamerlane accomplished was the systematic destruction of human hope itself. The shepherd boy, who had been mocked for his poverty and his lameness, had proven that birth meant nothing compared to will and ruthlessness. The 90,000 heads that once formed Tamerlane's monuments have returned to dust, but their silent testimony endures. That evil, when given absolute power, will always choose the path of maximum destruction. And sometimes, the most dangerous monsters are the ones who started as victims themselves.